So we're going to move on to probably one of my new favorite lines in chess, the Napoleon Gambit. I went down a rabbit hole with this one, and honestly, this line probably deserves a Chess Openings Explained video of its own. I was going through, and it looked like the theory... There's actually, not much theory here, but I was doing some engine analysis and playing some lines against one of my coworkers here, and there's quite a few only moves that both sides need to know. So we'll get our Scotch here, and they take on d4. We're going to take on d4 with the knight, and after they take back with the pawn, we're not going to take on d4 with the queen. Instead, we're going to play bishop to c4, and this is known as the Napoleon Gambit, and this opening gets its name from a game between Napoleon Bonaparte versus one of his generals back in 1818. Now, in that game, Black decided to go bishop c5. And this is one of the first ideas of the Napoleon Gambit, is that if they go bishop c5, White is immediately winning. After bishop f7, king takes on f7, and queen h5, forking the king and the bishop. Now, in that game, Napoleon did not play bishop f7. So I'm not going to go through that game, actually, but feel free to look it up yourself. I just think it was a very, very messy game and definitely suspicious. But I was doing some looking around, and there's a couple ideas Black can have. First off, let's take a look at queen f6. Queen f6 holds on to the pawn, develops the queen, and you can't really punish this, I don't think. I think after castles and knight e7, after c3 and knight c6, I think this position's pretty balanced. White is slightly better because you take on d4 here, and after queen takes d4, you play something like queen c2. I think this is fine for either side. Queen f6 is probably a legit move that you can play. But I guess there's two other moves we should look at. One is c5, trying to hold on to the pawn with their own pawn. But here, White doesn't really need to do much that's special. They castle. Black plays d5, trying to break up this center here, but White can just take bishop d6 and c3, trying to get them to take and recapture with the knight to develop further. If you play rook e1, it looks very natural. It's actually just met by knight e7, and Black is ready to castle. I don't think I would prefer to play rook e1 and force Black to block. I think I would rather have them need to spend a move to block anyway, because I guess the tempo you gain by moving your rook, Black gains it back by developing their knight. So that's why I'm recommending c3. Now knight e7, and you can take on d4. After they take on d4, queen takes. And after Black castles, I think White is just a healthy pawn up. I don't see any crazy way Black can try and win this back right away. I guess there's queen a5 in the future, but that can be met with knight c3. I think this is just... knight c3 comes first, so I think this is just a nice position for White. Healthy pawn. The last idea, this is where I went down the slippery slope. d5. d5 is, again, trying to muddy the waters a little bit, and I think White should take with the bishop. White can take with either, but I think taking with the bishop is a bit nicer. And, okay, if Black tries to hit the bishop, you just retreat the bishop back to b3, and natural development should get you far enough in the game. We have moves like knight d2, trying to develop the knight, queen f3. It looks like you're blocking the knight, but you're trying to go knight e4, getting the bishop pair. And after a5, White has a game. You can play, not a3. You can play a4 here and be fine. Develop the bishop, somewhere. I think d2, and then get your rooks into the center. This is pretty straightforward if they play c6. The real trouble comes when they play knight f6, because now they're threatening to take on d5 and win their pawn back, or maybe some ideas of taking on e4 combined with queen e7. It's a little slow for that plan, but it exists. And here, white should be content with taking the pawn. All right, that was easy. We just take the pawn. We're good. That's it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Black does want to try and get their pawn back, and d5 is going to be their target for the next couple of moves, mainly because the bishop can't move. If this bishop moves, the queen hangs. So, okay, c6 looks very natural. This is actually a blunder. c6, trying to get the bishop, fails to bishop f7. And if the king takes, you win the queen. Or if king e7, well, now you just trade queens, and after f3, white is just in a winning endgame. They're up 2 pawns. Absolutely no reason why they should lose this. So, okay, if c6 doesn't work, how are we going to put pressure on d5? We go bishop to e6. And again, you cannot capture because you would hang your queen. So knight to c3, just reinforcing d5, reinforcing e4. And now we're met with c6, because now there's no bishop to f7. And now white has to decide what to do. You have 2 options here. One, which I guess is fine, I'm not a big fan of it, is queen a4, just pinning the pawn. But now knight takes d5, and after ed5, bishop d5, and castles bishop e6, black is the one with the bishop pair, and it is a fairly open board, and the pawns are pretty symmetrical. So I think having the bishop pair is a nice advantage here for black. Now white does have the move. You can start with like rook d1. This is fine, but again, I hardly think black has any problems. So rather than queen a4, a bit sharper is bishop to g5. And after bishop to g5, I think both sides need to start paying attention and being accurate. Black should go bishop to e7. If they take the pawn right away, I think white is doing just fine after e5. This knight is pinned. And if you try and go bishop e7, then white is going to be winning. After pawn takes, bishop takes, you can just trade on f6. And black's structure is not a structure. This is just a bunch of targets as far as I'm concerned. Or if they take with the pawn, then bishop to e3. And again, these are just targets. It's not a pawn structure. They're not helping each other out. So you can't really take on d5. So bishop to e7. After bishop to e7, let's see, what do I have here in my notes? We have castles. So castle's long. You're putting more pressure on the d file. And here, there's 2 moves that black has. There's queen a5. And after queen a5, there's 2 options that white has. The first option is to bail out with like queen a4. Not in this position, I don't believe. But you take on f6 first, bishop f6, e5, bishop g5 check, f4, and bishop takes f4, queen f4, cd5. This is where they have the option. They can bail out with queen a4 and just get like a equal endgame, or they can play king b1 and keep this alive, keep the queens on the board. So this is one idea if they go queen a5. The other idea black has, instead of going queen a5 right away, probably more critical, is taking on d5. And In this position, statically, white is down a piece, but we're going to get it back. The only move here is e d5. After e to d5, this is similar to like one of those knight d5 sacrifices in the Najdorf, and black cannot capture on d5. If they capture with the queen, thank you for the queen. If they capture with the bishop, you take on f6, they take on f6, queen a4 check, and this piece is falling. So you will get your minor piece back, and white is up a pawn. And now after some moves by black, you see like g6, white has this idea of h4 and h5. And just run the pawn all the way down to h6, why don't you? After king h8, king b1, just trying to get away from any possible checks. Queen d6, you can trade. And we'll see that we actually get into a losing rook endgame. White is up a pawn. This pawn's on h6, trapping the king. And it's going to be relatively simple to get these rooks to the 7th rank. So bishop takes d5 won't work. At the same time, knight takes d5 won't work because this will also lead to a losing rook endgame after bishop e7. And now if knight e7, this is meant by queen takes g7. You're attacking the rook, you're attacking the queen, you cannot save both. And if rook g8, trying to trade queens, well, I'm going to take your queen and laugh and say check. So queen takes e7 is forced because of this, and now knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now instead of taking right away, you take on g7, hitting the rook, hitting the bishop. You're going to be winning material. Rook f8 to save the rook is met with rook d5, and now rook e5 is a threat supported by the queen, so black must play f6, and met by a queen trade. Rook to e1, king f7, and rook d7. White is killing black. King g6 and take on b7 is just disaster. So many extra pawns. So what does black do? They can't capture on d5. They're going to go for some counterplay. Queen to a5. And after queen to a5, I believe a nice continuation for white is bringing the rook towards the center. This is exactly like our classical Najdorf, in where, again, if black decides to try and capture, well, we run into some big problems because of this pin. The position here just is not good for black. Queen takes f6 is possible. Knight d5 is possible. There's so many ways to win. So that being said, black shouldn't capture on d5 with the bishop. However, in this position, they do have knight takes d5, which is one of their only moves. Actually, the only move to continue. And here, white's only move to keep an advantage is queen g7. This has the exact same ideas we've been talking about. It hits the rook. You're looking to take on d5, and if bishop takes, rook takes e7, should be winning. So black needs to castle, get the king out of the center, defend the rook on h8. But now there is rook takes d5. A couple things going on with this move. First, knight takes c3 doesn't look too friendly. Second, after rook takes d5, you're taking the defender of e7. So it's like giving up a rook for 2 pieces. And black captures back. If they capture with the bishop, this is just lost after bishop takes e7. Rook takes e7 is not lost. If rook takes e7, there is bishop to e6, trapping the rook back here. And what is it? I guess you go queen f6, and black starts getting active pieces, I guess. But taking with the bishop does keep up the pressure because you're hitting the rook. And after moving the rook to e8, queen to e5, protecting, you're going to be winning this bishop back. This should be just winning, and it is. So They can't take with the bishop. They have to take with the rook. Now you take on e7, and rook to e8 is mandatory. You have to keep up the pressure. You have to stay in time with white's development and activity. So rook e8 hitting the bishop, making white react is the way to go. It should also be mentioned you definitely cannot play knight d5 because it hangs checkmate. So don't be greedy. Don't take the rook. Just defend your piece. Move it out of danger. And now rook f5 is an idea hitting the f pawn. You can just play f3. And I was going to end my analysis here, but I asked myself, what is, does black have any threats here? And black can continue the game with b5. And the idea is going b4, hitting the knight, and after the knight moves, coming in with the queen and the bishop. So white does have to respond to this. b3 is good. This is playable. It's still much better for white, but I wanted to give myself the world's biggest headache, so I started analyzing rook takes e6. And taking with the rook is not good for black because of queen f8. The king is forced to the 7th rank, and now you take on f7. So white gets another pawn, and after king d6, bishop e7, white will end up winning an exchange. So they can't really take back with the rook. I was looking, they have to take back with the pawn, which looks a little scary at first because now this queen does have more influence over the board in general. It keeps black's king stuck to the back rank. So here there's also this tactic, queen f7, hitting the rook. And if the rook simply moves, you have queen to e6, picking up the other rook. This rook is being hit. That's just winning for white. So black must give back an exchange, and white should take the rook with check. And after just a couple more moves here, blocking with the queen, I didn't want to trade queens. This is just, it lends itself to black, but this should be a draw, or at least very balanced. But queen takes b5 is probably white's only try left. And after queen d4 by white, I think queen to e8, king b7, queen e7, and you have to move the king back. You can't do anything with the queen. You hang your queen. Queen's also busy defending the rook. So I think here, this position has never been reached. But it looked like there were a lot of only moves. And I thought this was very exciting. I would love to see this played in a game. But I believe this position should be a draw. I think black is active enough. But computers are lending themselves towards white. And it looks like, white does still have a few ideas with playing a 3, b3. But this probably deserves way more analysis than I can give it for our lecture here. We are 10 minutes over, but this is it. This is our first part of many parts to the Scotch game. Here's our third move, sidelines. I hope you guys are excited about this gambit as I am.